Welcome, everyone, to the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. I'm Lisa Witter, the co-founder of Apolitical and the CEO of the Apolitical Foundation. We'll talk about that in a second, but I am super excited to be here with, I don't think he knows this, but one of the people that's really influenced how I think about the work we do at Apolitical and our foundation, Professor Cass Sunstein. He said I can call him Cass. So I'm going to call him that going forward. I'm going to give you a little bit of his background, and then we're going to get right into it. We only have 25 minutes, and this man's brain is full of information and practical ideas for those of you working in government to apply and think about in your work. I'll say that Cass's reputation inside the US, I'm an American, and sort of I've followed his work closely as an American working inside and outside of government, is of a really nice guy, a really approachable guy, a guy that isn't just stuck in an ivory tower with his academic, but translates his academia to practical use for people like me to go ahead and bring it to practice. He's funny on Twitter, and one of the things, Cass, I find most endearing is your humor on Twitter and your support of your wife, who is now the head of USAID. And it's just wonderful to see like a power couple doing good in the world. So thank you for not just your academic work, but the way you go through the world. I'm going to introduce him a little bit, and then we're going to get right into some personal questions, going to check his optimism, talk about his new book that's just out, and then we're going to end a little bit on some politics, because how can you not? So Cass is an American legal scholar and a New York Times bestselling author, and was the administrator of the White House Office on Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Obama administration for several years. He was a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. So for the non-Americans, very prestigious university that government and opinion leaders really look at for ideas and cutting edge ideas. He was there for 27 years. And then he went on to be the founder of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. That's when I first started learning about his work. In 2014, he did some legal publications and some research was done. He was the most frequently cited American legal scholar by a wide margin. I wonder if that was a goal of yours or just happened to be that way. And then in 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway. And sometimes this is described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and Humanities. And so here we are speaking to you. Mostly people listening are from government. So here's our Nobel Prize winner in this space. He now is with the Biden administration as a senior counsel on regulatory policy and an officer in the Department of Homeland Security, overseeing regulatory policy and climate change issues. I let Cass know I'm just back off the plane from Greenland up there with climate scientists and looking at the urgency of that. So what an important time to have someone like you in this role. But it's really important that you know he is not here representing the Biden administration. He's here as a Harvard professor and an author. So warm welcome, Cass. Very nice to have you. So I wanted to start off before we get into your deep body of work, getting a little personal. And I just talked about your legal background and your scholarly background, but what's something about you that's not normally in your bio that influences how you think about your work?
Well, since the age of 12, I've been an avid squash player. Squash, not the vegetable. I don't think it's possible to be a player of the vegetable, but of a racket sport called squash, which is a little like tennis in a small room. And I played in high school, I played in college on a national championship team, and I play a lot. And that influences my attitude toward everything. Sometimes I'm losing. I'm down 9-4 in the fifth, and for squash players, one knows that's a very bad situation, and you do the best you can, and maybe you'll pull it out. Probably not, but you'll try.
So would you describe yourself as competitive then?
Yes, I hope one thing you learn from squash is respect for and grace toward your opponent, because if you don't have that, you're going to get hit by a ball or a racket or by a very hard look. So one tries to win, but if you don't, there's tomorrow, and you congratulate the person who broke your heart.
Oh, well, thanks, Cass. I have to say, as a Title IX baby, as an American woman who really benefited from policy, really boring sounding policy that made me a competitive athlete. My nickname was Animal. I deeply connect with you on the role of sports plays in our work and our desire to make the world a better place. It seems like that's shared. Now, I want to check on your optimism. You have a really hard role. I mean, if you're looking at climate change issues, we know the latest IPCC report was out. We're looking on our TV screens of just political situations, political polarization, foreign policy. You're not going to talk about that from the position of the Biden administration, but just personally inside of you, if 10 is super optimistic about the future of the world, and one is, oh man, I'm not optimistic at all, where are you and why?
8. And I'd say I'm at 8 as opposed to 2 or 3, partly for temperamental reasons. Amos Tversky, the great psychologist, the founder of modern behavioral science, said, I'm an optimist, and that's rational, because if you're a pessimist, you suffer twice. Once when the bad thing happens, and once you're thinking about it. And I think that's a deep truth about good way to go about life. But if you look at the arc of human history, there's a lot of reasons to think with respect to climate change and all else that optimism is justified by the facts. Look at destruction of the ozone layer, where it was thought we were in very deep, I think the right word is trouble, because this is a family audience, and we avoided the deep trouble with the Montreal Protocol led by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And if you look at the fear of nuclear war, when the Soviet Union and the United States both were at loggerheads and also threatening at times to go to war, it turned out that we found a way. And I worked in the Obama administration and saw in real time tremendous creativity on the part of government in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles, from power plants, from many more sectors. And while we aren't nearly where we should be, we're a lot better off than we were in, let's say, 2007. In terms of technology and regulatory options, certainly, and to a significant extent, regulatory practice. So I think we'll get where we need to get.
That's great. I was going to ask you about your optimism about government being able to adapt to the 21st century, but I got with your opening that you are kind of constitutionally optimistic. So I want to ask a bit of a different question. So I co-founded a global learning network for people in government around the world to learn not just about the policies that we can be sharing with one another, but also the mindset and the skills that we need for government to take us into this new world and to adapt to climate change, globalization, inequalities, all the issues that we care about. What's the one skill you think that needs to be sharpened inside of government that's not sharpened that will help us move forward?
What a great question. So, as someone who studied literature in university, I would say to have a working understanding of economics is the one skill, where economics can be understood, in a kind of technical way, economics as it's taught and studied in university, or economics can be understood in a way that kind of builds on practice about how human beings behave and how our markets work. So to have an understanding of that, I think, is essential, whether you're talking about a pandemic or climate change or obesity or equality. That's the one.
All right, that's fantastic to hear. So one good way to learn about economics would be in reading a bunch of your work. So it's a good segue into your books. I believe you published more than 10 books. And so I want to take the listeners through a tour of some of them at the high level, what they're about. But then if there's one particular practical takeaway for these beautiful bureaucrats that are listening to apply to their work. So your latest book is Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. If you could give us just a quick it resonates with me, in the era of what we live in now. The world feels noisy. When I was sitting listening to the glaciers calve in Greenland just yesterday, it sounded really loud in a different way than all the information coming to us. So if you can give us a top line on what the book is, and then maybe a tip or takeaway for the bureaucrats.
Okay, I am a bureaucrat now, so hello, brothers and sisters in the world of bureaucracy. So the book is about two things. One is bias, and the other is noise. So think of bias as a scale, which always shows you, like my scale, as heavier than you actually are. That's a bias scale. Or a scale that shows you as lighter than you actually are. That would also be a bias scale. People who are discriminators or who are too optimistic about their plans, or people who are focused on today and not the long term, speaking of climate change, those are biased people. And many bureaucrats are biased. They have some sort of cognitive bias about, let's say, the ability of a plan to get executed quickly, or they may have some sort of motivated reasoning where there might be a bias in favor of thinking the world is going to work out as they would like it to work out. Those are biases, systematic error. The book has a lot to say about biases. There is also noise, which is variability. So if you get on a scale, and sometimes it shows you as a little heavier than you actually are, and sometimes it shows you as a little lighter than you actually are, that's a noisy scale. A GPS device that underestimates how long it's going to take, that's a biased GPS device. One that's all over the map, that's a noisy GPS device. The book is about the severity of the problem of bias, which is increasingly known in governments as well as in individual life, and also, and more directly, the severity of the problem of noise, which has been widely neglected. Noise is a little bit like the invisible killer, the person in a movie who is, not very interesting and kind of in the background, and it turns out he's the one who killed everybody. The bias is more like Elvis Presley or Taylor Swift. Bias has charisma. And that's the dynamic in the book. The big lesson of the book, that is what we worked very hard and took a long time to get to, is the idea of decision hygiene. So if you are a bureaucrat like me now, or like many people all over the world, and you want to do your job well, don't only think, what are my biases and what's the medicine I can take against them, but also think, what are the sources of noise, meaning inconsistency in government's judgments? And how can I use some hygiene so as to avoid that? And I'll give a few examples. In the criminal justice system and in awarding disability benefits, there's a ton of noise. There's shocking noise. There's scandalous noise. And the thing to do about that is have some guidelines. If you have guidelines, you can reduce noise very dramatically. And often we underrate the importance of guidelines as a way of reducing unfairness and of reducing in government and in business really high costs. Here's another idea. Delay your intuition. You're going to use your intuition eventually, but you don't use it in the first hour, use it in the last hour. Compile a lot of structured information about your problem, like whom to hire or what option to choose. Get the independent pieces, like if it's about whom to hire, what's their educational background, what's their experience, what are their recommendations, think of them independently. If it's an option, whether to go forward with, let's say, a new reform, think of what could go wrong. What could go right, along what dimension could it go right, what are the costs and what are the benefits if it goes right, and use your intuition only at the end. That's a second form of decision hygiene. It's like washing your hands. Third, get a second opinion. Preferably get a second opinion from someone who cares about your welfare and likes you, but doesn't care about your feelings. That person you're going to get a second opinion from is likely to tell you something that you might not want to hear, but that you need to hear.
It sounds like my husband. He does that quite often to me, and I'm very very grateful. So that's very structured advice about what the noise is and the hygiene checklist on how to do it. I've just bought it. I'm in the middle of it, Cass, in the middle of the noise book and finding it. On one hand sobering, but on the other hand, again, back to the optimism, just practical. Anytime there's like clear things to do, I can do something with that. I can put a framework into that. And as a former bureaucrat myself, I know was in rooms where we used our gut to make decisions with not enough structured data or input. So really helpful practical advice. Let's move a bit on to nudge. It's like a tour through your great work. Maybe can you give a top line? This book really changed how I think about the world and the work we do. It's really built into what we do at Apolitical, and I would say consistently having more and better insights into behavioral science. And just how to improve decisions is something that bureaucrats or public servants in our network, it's one of the top things they want to know about. So you really ushered in a movement of governments thinking about how to do this. And then you followed with a second book that looked at the ethics of all of this, because it's a big question, like how do we have ethical use of nudge? So tell us a little bit about nudge, some practical advice, and what you learned in writing it.
Thank you for that. That book, probably more than any other, has been a labor of love, and we just did a new edition, which we call the final edition. The authors, Dick Thaler and I, had a little bit of an argument about whether it was the final edition. He won. I love it so much that I want to have more and more editions. He thinks, the final edition, that's a good commitment strategy. This is the last one. The basic idea behind nudge is that often in life, it's very good to have an intervention that steers you, but that maintains freedom of choice. So if we're talking about something like savings or spending or diet or what car to buy, in general, there are limits, but in general, people should be free to choose. But a GPS device is super helpful if you're trying to get where you want to go. And a GPS device is the kind of nudge that we all can benefit from when we are figuring out what to spend the money on, what to save money for and how much, and what car to buy or what to do when we have a medical problem or an economic problem. So nudges preserve freedom of choice. They insist that people can go their own way, but they do some steering. An example is automatic enrollment in, let's say, a savings plan, or automatic enrollment for poor people in a program from which their children can benefit. They can opt out if they think it's a dumb program, but they're in. They don't have to fill out forms. Making it easy is kind of rule number one for nudging. And simplification can often change everything. With respect to COVID vaccination, if it's easy to get vaccinated, you're going to see a substantial increase in vaccination rates. Not 100%. Some people aren't going to do it even if it's easy. But a nudge in the form of simplification can make things a lot better for people. If you go to a grocery store and there's information about, this has peanuts and this has shrimp and this has that many calories and this has a lot of salt in it, you are being nudged in the sense that you're being given some information that can steer you in one or another direction. Maybe you love salty foods, and the fact that this has a ton of salt is a positive. Fine, so far as nudging goes, go for it, get the really salty peanuts or cashews, but you are being informed at least, and to that extent nudged. So the advantage of nudges is that they ultimately respect individual agency. They say you are the author of your own life within limits, but the limits are pretty broad. But your authorship should be informed by clarity about how you're going to get where you want to go. That's what a GPS device helps with.
That's great. Well, if you're listening to us, if you haven't read it, please Google it, order it from your local bookstore, however you do it. It's really a life-changing book to think about, not just for people in the policy space, but how to think about your own lives, how to think about your families, it's been really important for me. I just want to run the listeners through just a couple other book titles so they can write it down right now. Get out your piece of paper or Google it as we're doing this. 2013, you wrote Simpler, The Future of Government, a big question we get at Apolitical. What is the government of the future, and what does it need to look like to be fit for purpose in the era of digitization and just in the era of a global world? Then you wrote the cost, or this is not order, but you also wrote the cost benefit revolution. Again, a call to all of us to learn economics in some sort of way to understand cost benefit analysis. Conformity in 2019, one of my favorite books I've read in the last 10 years, How Change Happens. Really brilliant book on social movements and how change happens. I had a lot of optimism, Cass, from that, telling the stories about how racism has changed in America, or gay marriage has changed in America, just how quickly things can move, despite all of the news we get. Just, it was a great book for those of you who think about social movements. And then in 2020, Too Much Information and others. So if he's not on your reading list, it's stuff that you can read on vacation as well as work, because it's that interesting and that absorbable. I want to move us in our last 6 minutes to a bit of a speed round on politics. So this is like applying what you know from the economic space into the political realm. Some may work, some may not. I co-founded Apolitical, which is for the public servants, the bureaucrats, but now I'm running our foundation, which is about the next generation of citizen politicians who inform those bureaucrats, who have the mandate from the citizens to inform. So I'm curious on some advice on some politics, how you think about it. So what we know is many voters look for someone they can have a beer with in a political candidate. How can political leaders navigate this? You definitely see some candidates that are really wonky and really use evidence-based, while at the same time, you know that some voters want you to be really likable. So is there anything that politicians can do to make the evidence base more important to the citizens?
Yes, that's also a terrific question. Thanks for that. So I think when voters want someone they can have a beer with or they like as their leaders, it's often they use that as a shortcut for someone they can trust and for someone who can do a good job. So if someone is talking about evidence kind of at them and not talking about problems to them, they might think this guy or this woman might be really smart, but I don't know if I can trust that person. I don't know if that person cares about me. So to think about evidence in a way that is human rather than robotic is really important. Before you get to evidence, often to tell a story is more persuasive and more connected and respectful, actually, because it's meeting people where they are. If it's a story that connects with the relevant voters' actual lives and challenges they face, all the better. To think as you're talking that you're someone who has a life that probably has problems in it, that is hoping you will help with and certainly not hurt with. And if you do that, then you automatically have an attitude of humility, and humility is likable. A sense of arrogance and superiority is not likable, and voters reasonably think that the humble person is going to listen and know what she doesn't know, and that's a very positive thing.
That's great. So I asked you the skill set of a public servant or a bureaucrat, one of the most important ones, and you talked about economics. What about a political leader? What's the skill set? Is it listening? Just to go off the back of it, is it empathy? Is it economics as well? If you have advice for up and coming political leaders to get skills to be more effective policymakers and leaders in general, what is that skill?
I think as you asked that, I think of a story actually, it turns out, which is that in, what was the year? It would have been the 1990s. I was standing outside a bookstore with my colleague, who's in his 30s. I just looked at him outside the bookstore and I said, you know, you should be president someday. And I never said that to any human being. It just occurred to me, and it was Barack Obama, who was my colleague at the University of Chicago. And what were his characteristics that make me have that, at the time, somewhat absurd thought? Well, a certain charisma, he has. So that's a good thing for leaders to have. A certain combination of confidence and curiosity. So
Mm.
that's a very good combination for a leader. If you think of great leaders in Europe and North America, uh, they often have some combination of those two. If they're high on confidence and low on curiosity, be afraid, maybe. If they're high on curiosity and low on confidence, they should probably become a physicist or something and not a leader. But that combination of skills is a very good one. When I think of good leaders or successful leaders, they give a sense that they really know what they're doing and they have a capacity to solve problems. There's actually something in social science called the confidence heuristic, which finds that people who are confident are more persuasive in meetings, even if they have no idea what they're talking about. So it's winning confidence. Curiosity, I think, is essential, and people really respond to it. Certainly about them, if they sense a leader is curious about their lives, that's very positive. But also, if they sense the leader is curious about how to get at a problem, rather than having clarity in advance, not only that they can solve a problem, which is very good, but that they have nothing to learn, that they're there.
Oh, I love that. What a way to end this, Cass. A few weeks before a German election, where many of our listeners are in Germany. I'm sitting talking to you here now in Berlin. And just great advice, I think, in general for the young politicians or up and coming activists going into government or people wanting to make a change in the world, looking for this confidence and curiosity. It seems like a great way to live my life, and I work at that. And you definitely exhibit it through your leadership, both now as a bureaucrat, but also as a thought leader. So, Cass, thank you so very much for your body of work, and I hope you'll stay connected to the work of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. We need your ideas as well as our work at Apolitical. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I should say the name Creative Bureaucracy, that is fantastic. Who could resist that? Thank you.
Great.